Hello, everyone, and welcome into the webinar today. We're here for today's roundtable discussion on misconduct and abuse by Buddhist leaders. My name is Emily Cohen, and I'm the program coordinator here at Faith Trust Institute. We're joined today by Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune, founder and senior analyst at Faith Trust, who will be moderating the conversation today among our three panelists, Chozen Bays, Edelstein, and Wendy Nakao. We'll be getting started in just a moment, but I have just a couple housekeeping items before we begin. If you're having any technical problems during the conversation today, please use the chat box on the right side of your screen, and you can send me a direct message, and I can help you with that. You can just find my name in the drop-down menu there and send it over. Our presenters will take time at the end of the conversation to answer questions from you, but please feel free to type them in along the way by using either the chat box or the Q&A box. And we'll do our best to answer as many as possible in the time that we have together. Our panelists have put together a list of resources which will be made available to you after we end the discussion today, but they'll be mentioning those during the conversation. And we are also recording this conversation to make it available on our website. So if people would like to access it after, or people who are not able to join us for the live conversation can do that later. So that is all from me. I will go ahead and pass it off to Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune to begin the conversation and introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here today with three distinguished colleagues and an opportunity to have a conversation about abuse by spiritual leaders within Buddhism in the United States. To begin, I just want to remind all of us that in all of our traditions, all of our faith traditions, we now know that we struggle with the issues of sexual abuse and exploitation by persons in leadership roles, whether it's pastor, priest, rabbi, teacher, etc. And as we have all begun to realize this over the recent years and begin to address it, we've learned a few things, and we've begun to see some of the patterns that seem to be fairly consistent and common across our traditions. And so I think the work in this area is one of the things that, as we share across our traditions, we learn from each other's experiences, and that's one of the reasons that we particularly wanted to take advantage of the time today to have this conversation with three leaders in Buddhism in the United States, and to hear from them and their thoughts and opinions about how things are going in the work in addressing exploitation by teachers within the Buddhist community. Of course, the problem with these boundary violations that we're looking at is that they result ultimately in harm to vulnerable people, students, congregants, etc. And so it is within that context of beginning to hear from persons who have those experiences and who've been willing and able to come forward and disclose their experiences that all of our traditions have been really pressed to address these issues and to deal not only with responding to those situations, but hopefully also with the possibilities of prevention. So our conversation today will involve the three colleagues I'm very happy to welcome. First of all is Chozen Bays. Jan is in the Portland, Oregon area. She's co-abbot of the Great Bow Zen Monastery and a pediatrician with 25 years of experience professionally in child abuse and domestic violence work. She also appears in Faith Trust Institute's resource, A Sacred Trust, as one of our speakers in that video series. We also want to welcome Scott Edelstein. Scott is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He's a longtime practitioner of both Buddhism and Judaism, and he's particularly known at this point in time for writing the book Sex and the Spiritual Teacher, Why It Happens, When It's a Problem, and What We All Can Do, which is a very helpful book that we're now recommending to the people we work with through Faith Trust from all traditions to help us understand these issues much more clearly, and I hope that he'll speak to his experience with his book as we talk together. And then also I want to welcome Wendy Nakao from the Zen Center of Los Angeles, where she serves as the abbot. And the Zen Center there has become a model for governance practices of shared stewardship and council discernment and decision-making in order to address some of the issues, the organizational and structural issues that have created some of the problems of boundary violations. So we look forward to her sharing from her experience in that regard. We're going to begin, and I want to assure all of you who are listening in that we welcome your comments and questions through the chat box, as Emily said. At any point, feel free to go ahead and communicate with us, and then we will do our best to respond to those issues as we can go along. But we want to begin by asking each of our colleagues here to just say a little bit about how they came to be involved in addressing these issues, kind of what brought them to this particular problem of violations and exploitation by teachers within the Buddhist tradition in the U.S. And I would like to ask Jan Bays if you would begin.
Thank you, Marie, very much, and thank you, everyone, for joining us on this seminar. I'm going to talk about my timeline in this venture and also a little bit about what I've learned along the way. I did my formal Zen training at the Zen Center in Los Angeles between 1973 and 1983. This was residential training in a community that we always laughed and said was a combination of a hippie commune and a Zen monastery, an odd combination. And while I was a student there, I was involved in romantic and sexual relationships with two of my teachers. When this came out, all of this came out at once, and both teachers had also been involved with other students. The center was in complete uproar, and both teachers left. Our main teacher went into alcoholism treatment in a residential facility at a different city, and the other teacher who had been involved with students went to support him. So I was left at the center with very, very angry people whose dreams and illusions had been overturned, and a lot of that anger was turned against me. I used to be afraid of stepping outside the door because I knew somebody would attack me. I felt it was part of my own practice to work with that as that happened. But I learned from that often the victims are blamed and that they blame themselves. Not that the victims don't have to do work later on, but that work can't be done until, as Faith Trust Institute says, justice is done, justice making is done. In 1984, I left the center and moved to Oregon, and I was quite disillusioned at the time. I thought, if this is how enlightened people behave, I want nothing to do with enlightenment. And that included myself, because I was also ashamed of my own behavior. How had I become so deluded and then rationalized my behavior? So I actually explored lots of other spiritual traditions, and eventually came back to Zen, but along the way I did a lot of reading about spiritual groups, like the Hare Krishnas, the Rajneesh group, Synanon, which was a recovery group, to try to find out what are the signs that a group is going off course. And that was a very interesting course of study for me. Then when I began teaching students on my own, I was actually stunned at the trust and vulnerability of people who came in for spiritual guidance. And I realized that to violate that trust was akin to child abuse, that these people were presenting as, the image that came into my mind was little flowers opening their hearts to me, and that there was indeed a sacred trust involved. During that time, we had, during the years after I left the Zen Center, we had more examples of teacher misconduct. I was working with Yvonne Rand and Alan Finauke, both of whom are in the Sacred Trust video, both Buddhist teachers, who had been working for years with people calling into them with incidents of misconduct. And the three of us formed a Buddhist clergy abuse hotline. So I would get calls every week from around the country from people who had suffered physical abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse by Buddhist teachers of from different denominations. So that was many years of working together trying to help and support victims. In 1994, my husband and I were the first Buddhists to take the Faith Trust Institute training on clergy misconduct and at Berkeley at GTU, and we found it was a wonderful, wonderful training. It's the most wonderful resource. I felt like there was sense made out of chaos and an organized way to approach this. I can't emphasize how invaluable the Faith Trust resources are. And so we began teaching from that syllabus. And we have been asked on a number of occasions to present material from the syllabus at the American Buddhist Teachers Conferences, at the Spirit Walk Teachers Group. We did an ethics workshop here for Buddhist clergy at the monastery. So we found there was a real need out there. However, we also found that people are not interested in this material unless there's a crisis. So when we tried to do preventive work and do a preventive workshop every 2 years, we found that people don't sign up unless there's a crisis they're dealing with, and then suddenly they want some information. I also educated our own Sangha. In fact, I educated them about clergy misconduct to the point where they asked for a break. They said, yeah, enough already. We don't have to do this every year, do we? So I backed off of that a little bit. Then Yvonne Rand and Marie Fortune and I offered a retreat for women victims of abuse by Buddhist teachers and Hindu teachers, and yoga teachers at our retreat center. And Marie came and actually trained Yvonne and me on how to do that kind of a retreat. And that was a real eye-opener. I think the most stunning thing from that was 3 women came who did not know each other and discovered in the first day of the retreat that they had all been abused by the same teacher over a 30-year period. And the person who was the last abused was just in despair that this had begun 30 years ago and no one had been able to stop it, to the point where she fell victim to the same teacher. So I've learned from working with victims the terrible damage that's done by clergy abuse. It doesn't mean all victims are terribly damaged. Some women say, well, this is just a blip in my life and I learned a lot and I can go on. But the worst damage that I think is done by clergy abuse in the sexual realm is that people become so self-critical of themselves and their own spiritual potential that they can be knocked off the spiritual path altogether. And they become so jaded and cynical about themselves and about whatever the spiritual tradition is and the leaders in its spiritual traditions that they take themselves off of any spiritual path. Some will look around and try to find a place to be safe, but some even feel nausea when they enter a meditation hall. It will not go back. And I think that's the greatest damage that we do, that we have this truly life-giving resource of our spiritual tradition, and to make it so that people cannot ever join any spiritual tradition again, or our tradition again, under another teacher is truly devastating and very sad to see. I wrote a few articles. This is kind of a funny story. I got interested in what the Buddha taught about sexual misconduct, and particularly sexual harassment. I had written an article about that, and then the whole Bill Clinton-Monica Lewinsky affair came out. And so I pulled this article out of my file drawer and sent it to Tricycle Magazine, sort of dusted it off. And they were very grateful because they felt like they had to do something about it, had some response to this issue of how do we work with this prominent figure who had been involved in sexual misconduct. So I wrote an article called What the Buddha Taught About Sexual Harassment. And then, along with Alan Sanalki and the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, we published a pamphlet called Safe Harbor. And that came out in 1998 with the first recommendations to Buddhist groups for setting up policies and procedures around sexual misconduct. And it had an article in it that I had written called Can This Spiritual Practice Be Saved? Modeled after the Good Housekeeping article on Can This Marriage Be Saved? And it was a chronicle of how a spiritual teacher and their partner, let's say their wife, in the case of a man, and their students can get tangled up in this kind of situation. So that was published in Safe Harbor and also in Turning Wheel in 1996. The Safe Harbor, one interesting thing about that pamphlet, which is still available through Buddhist Peace Fellowship for $5, is that we got a grant from a woman who had been part of a sangha where a number of women were victimized. And she was, let's say, economically victimized because she was a large donor. And when that teacher left, they took all the money, cashed in all the resources, including the real estate, and picked up their tents and their money and left. And the congregation, the sangha, was left totally bereft, without a teacher and without even a building to meet in to be able to work through their issues. So that woman actually donated money so that we could send the Safe Harbor pamphlet to all the known Buddhist congregations, sanghas, and teachers in the U.S. So I thought that was a huge step.
Jan, let me
yes.
point out that those resources that you're referencing will all be on the resource list that everybody will get.
Right.
I wonder if we should go to Wendy and kind of check in with her, and then we're going to come back around to talk more about what you see the current situation to be.
Yes, thank you. I'm ready to hear somebody else talk.
Wendy, how did you get here?
Good morning, Jan, and thank you so much, Marie and Jan and Scott and the Faith Trust Institute for putting on this webinar. It's the first time I've participated in something like this, so it's quite an adventure. You'll notice my screen went blank for about 10 minutes, but I won't touch anything while I'm talking. So for me, my introduction to teacher misconduct came very early on in my Zen practice, and pretty much all of it has been experiences at Zen Center of Los Angeles. And I was thinking about how many Sangha incidences we went through over the last 45 years. UCLA is 45 years old. And at first I thought, well, there's one, and then there's two, and then there's three. So all along, for me, it's been a very slow evolution. I think it's been remarkable how Jan, for example, was jumped into the whole thing and kept going in terms of education and training and sharing what she knows. But I sort of just plodded along, and I would have this question, how is it that this keeps happening? And why is it? This actually was my biggest question is, why is it that a community completely disintegrates when this happens? And so I've been through a number of times when the Sangha completely fell apart. And so the question of what do we need to do? What is going on in our spiritual practices? First of all, that this happens, but also as importantly, that a community of spiritual practitioners do not seem to have the skillful means to go through a situation when it does happen. And my feeling is, even with all the education and training that we have and need to have and will continue to do and encourage people to do, these things do occur. And when they occur, what is it that we have in place? What are the practices and containers and structures that we have in place that can hold the upheaval and enable people to commit to seeing it through. And this is, I think, a very big issue for the Buddhist community, maybe any spiritual community who's been through it. Because I think we all know of communities that disintegrated and never found their way back together again. So having gone through a number of these experiences, and most recently in 1997 when I was asked to return to VCLA to, quote, heal the Sangha, end of quote, if such a thing is possible. After the death of VCLA's founder, and a year and a half after that, there was another incident of sexual misconduct and alcohol. Those are the two trademarks of the White Sun, it seems. And we had another incident, and again, the center was at a particularly fragile time, and again collapsed. So I was asked to return to just attend to the situation, with no big hopes of anything, to just see what was there. So that, in a way, is kind of a turning point for me of putting myself physically in the situation and keeping myself there, and walking through step by step to see what needed to be done. How do you go through a situation like that when it seems that all is lost? So that's been my focus and my emphasis, and I could say my big training in terms of looking at forms of practices, governance issues, issues of power over, how to shift that to power with, and to generally turn over everything about a spiritual community that I knew, and to start to fashion something that was very different in terms of empowering everyone to the best of our ability. So it required me to go through a lot of internal shifting myself, and also to struggle with the Sangha here that remained and the new people that came, to say, okay, everything's collapsed, let it go, let's not try to save anything. Let's just take care of the people, the victims, first of all, and most important to take care of. Nothing else is as important. And step by step, we will figure out how to come through and reshape and restructure ourselves and the organization. And I just want to say that I believe that attention to the spirituality of the organization is very, very important. That very often the structures that we are maintaining or assuming that are necessary can actually help contribute to these types of behaviors and prevent us from being able to effectively deal with them when they happen.
Very good, Wendy. Thank you. And I want to come back to several of those points you raised, particularly about structure. But let's hear from Scott, please. How did you get to where you are, Scott? And why did you write the book specifically?
Well, first, if I may, Maria, I'd like to make a correction and tweak a couple of things that were said. The correction is, just to be clear, I'm not a leader in the Zen Buddhist community in any way. I'm a member of Dharma Field, which is a Zen community in Minneapolis. But I'm not a director or a leader or a spiritual teacher. I've not received Dharma transmission, and I make no claim to any special spiritual insight. I'm a writer who investigated this, wrote a book, and has written some articles on the subject. The other things I want to clarify, and then I'll say a bit about myself, is that as we've been speaking today so far, the word victim has been associated with the word woman, and I want to make it clear that there are male victims as well. The great majority indeed are women, and the great majority of the perpetrators are men. So that's absolutely true, but I also don't want people who are male victims to feel like they're being overlooked because they shouldn't be, and they deserve better. The second tweak I want to make is you spoke of congregants and Sangha members as being vulnerable people, and I just want to add the observation that everyone is a vulnerable person. There's no such thing as an invulnerable or non-vulnerable person, including the teachers. And indeed, often the victims, the primary victims of teacher misconduct and spiritual leader misconduct are, of course, their own students and congregants. They do themselves a great deal of harm as well. In my case, I was a member of the Minnesota Zen Center when a couple of things happened. First, there was all of what went down at the San Francisco Zen Center involving Richard Baker, where there was all kinds of misconduct and malfeasance. And the teacher in Minneapolis, Diane Katagiri, our teacher who had come from San Francisco Zen Center, was sent back there as a stabilizing force for a year. He was asked to come back, and he volunteered to help them through the midst of the worst of their crisis. But in fact, Katagiri himself had been having a long-time affair with one of our priests, and there were other encounters as well with other people. So at a certain point, I started to say, as more and more of these got revealed, there are two things that happened. One was, it was clear to me that these were not isolated incidents, that in fact these were not a few wayward teachers, that the problem was endemic, and that's what I'll be speaking about later on today. The other thing that's important is if you're a writer, often what you do is you simply say, boy, I wish there was a book on, and you fill in the blank, and then you hit yourself in the head and go, well, duh, it's not been written, it needs to be written. What does that mean? And so, of course, I went and wrote it, and many people, of course, were instrumental in helping that happen, including, full disclosure, Jan, who's one of the people in today's webinar. She was extremely helpful in putting that book together. And in one sense, my book is a great unpacking of what Safe Harbor does. So that's my story.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Scott. So let's move now to, again, remind our participants to give us some questions or comments as we go along. We're totally open to that. But we want to talk now about kind of how each of you see the current situation, sort of what's, each of you have begun to speak to that because it's part of the experience you bring to this. But I was particularly interested in some of the structural questions that you each briefly spoke about, and wonder if you could pursue those. And so let's go back to Jan to begin.
Hi everyone. In terms of the state of things now, my assessment is that we're out of the dark ages and we're moving very slowly into the age of reason. And largely thanks to the help that Faith Trust has given us with various incidents that we've had. There's a lot still to work with. There are at least two male teachers, Buddhist teachers, who have been transgressing against students for decades, and those situations are not solved yet. One of the big helps, I think, has been the Internet, because nothing can remain hidden. And one of my philosophies is we should live life as if nothing is hidden. That just makes life a lot easier. And indeed, with the Internet, things get out so fast, especially with the site Keeping Zen, which is a kind of news service for the Buddhist community, that it helps everybody understand that things can't be hidden very long, which is helpful. I think secrecy is one of the most corrosive aspects of these situations. Still to be done, I think we need to educate all Sanghas again. Sending out Safe Harbor was a great idea, but we need to provide more education again. We need to have all Sanghas set up ethics statements that are public when people walk in the door, to set up policies and procedures that are ready to go when something happens. We need to help clergy with our own issues of healthy sexuality and taking care of themselves, and boundary issues. I think prevention does work. I had one incident where a teacher called me up and said, I'm in trouble and I'm calling you now. And he had a favorite, he was married and had a family, but he had a favorite young woman student. And they'd gone out for coffee a few times, and on the way back that night he had hugged her and given her a little kiss on the cheek. And he came in and realized I'm in trouble and called me, and we had a long talk. At the end of it, the question that I asked him that really helped him resolve the issue was, what is your highest hope for her? And his highest hope for her was that she would also become a Zen teacher. And I said, you have to consider that if you have an affair with her, that will seriously compromise her ability to do that. So I think that was a beautiful example of when prevention works. I think one of the issues that we are not dealing with well yet is how to reinstate offending clergy, how to know when the work that they have done with therapy, apology, restitution, and so on has been done, and they could come back into their calling as a clergy person, as a Zen priest, or a lay Zen teacher. And recently we had a situation where everyone felt that this person had done their work and could be reinstated in our particular denomination, the White Plum. But in talking to one of his victims about this before he was reinstated, she said, "How can you guarantee that he's safe? Can you guarantee this, what happened to me will not happen again?" And her life was, she suffered serious years and years of suffering. And what can I say to her? Can I say, yes, I know he's safe forever? I don't know that. And what we tend to do is, in some of the other Buddhist organizations I belong to, is just take somebody back in because they show up to the next meeting. And then there's a lot of disgruntlement, especially among the women teachers. How do I know this person is safe? I'm not going to send women students to them if they transgressed against women. I think that's a little bit about some of the issues that we're facing right now.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think that's a challenge that we all face, Jan, in terms of what happens next after an intervention that basically calls the problem to the fore and prevents the person from functioning. So what happens next? And it's a very challenging part of this work. So we'll come back to that. Wendy, what else would you like to offer in terms of where you see things now?
Well, I certainly agree. We seem to at least know now there's a problem. I think it's taken many years for that acknowledgement, to say that with conviction. That seemed to have taken a while in different quarters, but and also truly, I think people now are looking at training, education for not just the clergy, but for all the members of the spiritual community.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a really interesting challenge. I was chuckling when Jan said her community said, "Do we have to do this every year?" And yes, you have to do it every year. You have to do it person by person, in groups, and every year, because and with every new person who comes through your gate, which is really a challenge, because we can have all our ethics statements and our statements of right conduct and our grievance policies and all of that. All of that is important. But they only become living documents if we create an environment where these things are alive, They're like very present in our awareness at all times. So I think the big challenge for us, and I know certainly for me at DCLA, is how to educate everyone. Because when we are educated and have the training, it not just serves us in our spiritual home, it serves us in our homes and in our workplaces, where we start to be able to name what's going on and be able to call things what they are. It's like you say, Marie, do we see what we're seeing? And once we see what we're seeing, then it takes us into a whole other realm of being able to address misconduct in all its many forms.
Yes, an ongoing process, never ending.
Ongoing. It takes so much commitment and courage and conviction.
Right.
But all you need is to talk to one person who has been seriously harmed, and there it is. You cannot turn away from it, nor should we.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And Scott, what's your perception of where things are and what needs to happen and what our challenges are?
Well, first I'd like to make sure we don't conflate Zen and Buddhism. Zen, of course, is one denomination in Buddhism. And right now, it seems to me that Zen is precisely where the biggest, the deepest, and the most common problems in American Buddhism are, with Tibetan Buddhism the second most. The Vipassana people, the people who are associated with the Insight Meditation Society, Jack Kornfield, Sharon Salzberg, and so on. That whole tradition in America is doing much better for reasons that I can speak about in a minute. And I confess I know nothing at all about the Nichiren Buddhist group. But it does seem to me that in order to create a healthy spiritual community, there's 5 different levels that have to be sane and supportive. I don't have the time to talk about them in any detail, but I'll very quickly review them. So number 1 is the level of the entire denomination or sect, and that is its governance, its norms, its standards, its expectations, its power structure, its student-teacher relationship. I will come back to that in a moment. The second is the support for teachers and the expectations of them, and Jan and Wendy spoke a bit about those. There has to be significant support so that they're not all out there on their own. The third is the structure and governance of the individual sangha or congregation, and that the spiritual authority needs to be separated from the organizational authority. If you have a board that's just a bunch of puppets following the teacher, you already have a dysfunctional organization. So unless the teacher, in terms of power within the organization, answers to a board that's not under the teacher's thumb or wing or other bodily parts, as long as that's separate, then you have a chance for a healthy organization. The fourth is the teacher's attitude toward the teaching, toward the students, toward the community has to be sane and supportive. The teacher is not always putting the student's best interests first, as Jan suggested in her example, then things are going to go awry. And the fifth is, let's also remember that a piece of this responsibility belongs to the congregant or student. They cannot just act out of their amygdalas and their emotions. I say they, but I'm a student, so I should say we. We need to have critical thinking, to examine the teachers carefully, not throwing ourselves at their feet, not to just go, oh, it feels right. If you've chosen a romantic partner that way, because either, oh, I'm just so attracted, or oh, he's got a lot of money, or oh, she's got a well-connected family, whatever, you know where that's going to lead into trouble. So if any one of these 5 things is out of kilter, the congregation or sangha is going to run into trouble. And right now, unfortunately, in Zen, and not in every single organization, but in general, in Zen and in Tibetan Buddhism in America, the first 2 are already out of kilter. Yes, we're certainly making efforts to put them back into kilter, but they're already out of kilter, and then, of course, once you have more than 2 or 3, you wind up getting into the dangerous cult. What I do want to talk about for just 2 minutes, please, is the very first of these, because that hasn't been talked about. And that is the entire essential power structure of Zen in America, which derives from Zen in Japan and Vietnam and other places where Zen comes from. And that is a veneration of teachers and everything from title, and this is true of Zen, I also think it's largely true of Tibetan, calling them things like, and forgive me, my 2 co-participants, calling them Roshi, which is a sort of term of venerability, if not outright veneration in America, calling them Rinpoche in Tibet, which means beloved, and creating this giant gap in terms of the power relationship, often making the teachers more than human. I think that does everyone a disservice, and it creates just a kind of breeding ground for narcissists and sociopaths and people with other mental illnesses, as well as just saying neurotic folks, to get up there and become teachers. Let me leave you with a parallel that I think is very telling. We've all seen what's happened with the Penn State scandal involving Joe Paterno and Jerry Sandusky. And any of you who've been involved in academia know that even though there's a lot of breastfeeding about this and a lot of things are being put in place to, quote, make sure it never happens again, unquote, it's going to happen again and again and again and again, and it continues to happen. There are scandals every year throughout NCAA football and basketball. Why? It's because the very nature of Division I sports is a setup for all these kinds of scandals. Sexual, financial, and the losers are always students and in some cases younger people. And right now, unfortunately, what we have is a similar situation, I would argue, in Zen and Tibetan Buddhism. Some places are learning, of course, and but I think a good example of what can be done, if you look at the State University of New York system, why in the world am I going to them? It's because they made a decision back in the 60s or early 70s. Have you noticed there have been almost no scandals in the 70 or so State University of New York colleges and universities? Why? They realized that Division I sports are going to create an endemic situation for scandal and abuse, and they said, we're not going to do Division I sports anymore. So they've got great athletic facilities, and you can learn things there, but there's very few scandals. So, I said my piece. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Yes, some very provocative possibilities that I want to pursue with all of you. But I want to do that by going to a question that we have in front of us from one of you. Because I think it relates to part of what Scott is raising here. The question is, recently we've become aware in our Buddhist order that some people come to Buddhism thinking that the master is perfect and won't break the precepts, or ask you to break the precepts. How best can we educate newcomers that teachers are fallible? Anybody?
Well, I tell them, this is Jan. Tell them I'm fallible. If people ask me, are you enlightened? I say, no, I'm not enlightened. I'm on the path, and I'm a guide. I've got a little more experience and a few more years than you do, and maybe I've taken a few detours that I can help you avoid. But I'm not enlightened. I don't set myself up in that way. And people who are around me know that I'm a very ordinary person, and as I get older, I'm getting more ordinary.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting situation because it goes back to the power structure. If your power structure is such that the teacher is at the very top and is functioning in such a way, no matter how ordinary they may seem, where it's a situation of power over people. I think you have a problem. So in my case, it's not enough for me just to be a nice person. It's just not enough for me to be an honest person with a lot of integrity, which I do my very best to be. I have to look at what is it that the organization here is actually saying, as a structure. What is it actually speaking to? And I think this examination, as Scott is pointing out, is absolutely crucial for us to do. And many of us, of course, may feel, well, I don't know how to do that. I need to call in an organizational consultant. But I would say we do know how to do that. We do know how to just gather in a circle and start examining and questioning and looking and trusting that our own wisdom can open up, And one of the things I have loved about the way we're working now at Zen Center is everybody's wise and everybody's teacher. And I'm not giving lip service to that, but we actually have, wonderful experiences of that. And therefore I can sit in the circle and not know, like, duh, and just amazed at what comes out of people and what comes out of the collective. We invite the collective wisdom to arise. Of course, I will acknowledge that the collective follies also arise. But if it's an ongoing practice, sooner or later, collective wisdom arises. And I think this kind of meticulous examination of our structures is absolutely crucial. And to not be afraid of making, sweeping changes if we need to make it. This structure produces such and such. No matter how good a person I am, it leaves me extremely isolated and in a place of disconnect, and on a pedestal that, I just can't wait to get off this thing. Not be off now, And I think we need to really look closely at the structure itself. I totally agree with that.
I really agree with Egyoku. We have a very strong board, and to me, taking refuge in the Sangha means I trust that if I sit back and don't say anything, wisdom will emerge. Collective wisdom from the group. And maybe sometimes I have to do a little steering if things are going way off and put in a few comments, but I'm not the one at the head of the board. I'm on the board, but I actually have a very passive role. Because I know, and I say this, I have an infinite capacity for self-deception and then rationalization. And so I depend on the Sangha, and my husband is also a Zen teacher, to really be honest with me about if they see that I'm off. And then I have my own teacher too. I just think that's extremely important, that all teachers have somebody that they're accountable to, who can see through them, whom they would not be happy to go to if they did something out of line.
Well, Ken, what you've suggested in how you relate to your students, I want to just say how much I appreciate you're presenting yourself as a kind of older, slightly wiser sibling. Because the communities that seem to be healthiest seem to have student-teacher relationships that resemble that. That is one of the things that happens in the American Vipassana community, not that they're perfect. In Tibetan Buddhism, the folks in Turgar are moving in that direction. They're not there yet. They're doing that with their American teachers. They haven't yet managed to do it with their Tibetan teachers. And then, of course, some Zen places have done that too. And by presenting yourself as a kind of older, slightly more experienced and wiser sibling, if you just teach that as a metaphor, it seems to me, all kinds of useful things come out of that, because it means you can, assuming it's a functional family relationship, as it were, that means you can trust the person. It means you don't take everything they say as gospel. It also means answering questions like, gee, should I have sex with this person? Should I give them all the money, all my money? Those are not things you do with your brother or sister. I also think you brought up some really important things about a major piece of a spiritual teacher's duty is to disabuse students of maybe that's their main duty in general, but to disabuse them of notions about enlightenment, about the teachers being anything but exactly as human as they are. And the other thing that's wonderful about what we all seem to be getting to is the importance of humility, which I would argue is one of the clearest and biggest hallmarks of any spiritual figure to trust. If they're not humble, right there I would probably say it's time to run away.
Well, I really appreciate what all three of you are saying about addressing the issues of the leadership role and the need for re-examining the way in which that has been expressed, and particularly Zen Buddhism in the U.S. I want to push you a little bit because, and again, I'm coming out of my experience in Christian organizations, but also working with other faith traditions, including Buddhism, and seeing how this plays out. But I totally agree with you that the clarity about being the older sibling model or what have you, but there's still a leadership role. And I think where we've struggled in the past is when I went into ministry, for example, some 35 years ago, and a lot of women at that point did so because we were concerned about what we were seeing in the way in which power was being used by predominantly male clergy at the time. And we were reacting against that. And part of what we brought to that critique at that point in time was the problem here is the power that these people have, and power is the problem, and so we're going to come in and have a different role, and we don't want that power. We want to be, in effect, peers with the people that we're serving and working with. And, that was, I think, an important critique 35 years ago, but my experience looking back on it is now I think it was a little bit naive, and we've learned some more things about it, because what it tended to do is to push us totally in the other direction, of basically saying, okay, the veneration and the pedestaling and all of that isn't the way to go. So the other direction is 180 degrees. And that's the way to go. And so, again, I'm much more now coming back to, okay, somewhere in the middle here is the place where those of us who are called into leadership, whatever that role is, have to be clear about those two extremes. And then how do we live out our leadership role within that with the kind of awareness that you've been talking about? So I wonder if any of you would like to react to how you see that happening.
Well, I'm happy to take that up. Marie, would you say it's fair to say that the issue can be framed as how do you reduce the power differential without reducing the wisdom differential? Because that's how I tend to look at it. Or am I misreading what you're saying?
I think yes and no in terms of what I'm saying. I think the job of any of us in a leadership role and being clearly aware of the vulnerability of students, parents, etc., and at particular times in their lives. But also part of our job is the empowerment of folks in their own journeys and their own awareness and so on and so on. So that we're always, trying to share resources that we might be able to mediate and bring to them that enhance their journey, whatever. And in that sense, make it less vulnerable, always recognizing that vulnerability is still a part of the life experience that they bring. So it's I think maybe a both and response to your way of framing that, Scott.
If I could. About 10 years ago, when we were at a place to look at how to recreate, I guess you could say, Zen Center of Los Angeles, because it had really collapsed after the death of its founders and an ensuing scandal. At the time, I thought, boy, this is just a really big pain. And then I began to see that we had an opportunity to recreate something completely different, that the old power structures did not serve well. It accomplished certain things and had collapsed for a reason. And that we didn't need to just, put people into these structures and try to keep going. There was nothing to save. Let it all go. And so once we took care of the critical things, such as taking care of the victims and attending to the wounding of the Sangha, and even making changes to our buildings, because, the buildings are physical centers embody these abuses as well. And need to shift. They need to change along with the attitudes and the governance issues. So we began to experiment with something we called shared leadership at the time. It has since morphed into shared stewardship. And what we did is we framed our Zen community as a mandala. Not as a hierarchical organization, but as a mandala. And so we looked at what is the ongoing balancing of the vertical, which Zen communities, as has been pointed out, is very strong in, and how to balance that with an equally strong horizontal dimension, which for me is the Sangha and the way of governance. Mm-hmm. So we began an experiment. I sent out a letter. We invited the Sangha, listen, here we are, all these years later. Everything's collapsed. We're ready to start anew. What do we do? And we just invited people to participate. And so I was amazed at the commitment people had to undertake a project in which we knew nothing about. But we were able to create a framework where we said, look, everybody's a leader here, everybody knows a lot of things, and everybody's wisdom is useful. And we want to find the structures that will call them forth and bring them forth in service of the community. So how to recognize the whole, and that everyone take responsibility for it, not just a few people, which meant, being very transparent. And it meant for everyone to learn how to work with each other. And this is really, comes down to the blood and guts. There's nobody who's going to tell you what to do, but together we're going to figure out what serves the community and what structure might serve. So we really undertook a lot of experimentation, and if something didn't work, we changed it. or created something else, or something worked, we expanded upon it. But every single person was asked to be a leader and to be a steward. And this was actually very fascinating for me to observe because people were terrified of it. People were terrified of sitting in a leader chair. They were like, oh my gosh, I can't do this. You know? And we said, well, you have to, because you need to take leadership of this particular part of the Zen Center. So all the issues that I think a lot of teachers go through, you know, I don't really know what to do, or in some cases, I really know, and then immediately that became a huge conflict with other members. So that led us to, well, how do we work through this, you know? So I don't know, you know, how many sanghas would have the patience and the conviction to go through something like that. But for us, it really did work, that we could learn how to share power and share it effectively. And that when we slipped into the old molds, you know, the old ways of doing things, the old internalized hierarchy, then it became obvious very quickly to ourselves and to each other. And so then we had to, you know, take a few steps back and figure out, okay, what happened here? How do we move forward? So I'm a big advocate of being willing to engage in process, an ongoing process. And it becomes clear pretty quickly that, you know, the teacher doesn't know everything, and that there's a lot of wisdom at play in a community that needs to be called forth in an effective way.
Well, and I think, Wendy, that the governance model that you've been working with, we've had several questions about governance models, and that's something that people may want to follow up with, your particular experience around that. But one of the questions I do want to get to here, again, goes back to some of the questions about structure that we all struggle with. The question is, as it stands, Sangha members are frequently asked to take their concerns to their local board, so assuming that there is a, you know, local board. The problem is that this is like asking the police department to investigate corruption in the department, and there's no separation of powers. I wonder if each of us could speak to that again. Kind of what's the mechanism? Because we all have this problem, and I think all professional people in our various organizations have a similar problem of we set up ways in which we try to monitor ourselves. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think there's some frustration in this question in terms of how can a local organization really hold its teacher accountable given where we are now. Can any of you speak to that?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question. This is Jan. I think one of our models is based on what the Buddha taught. If you have an issue with someone, first you need to go talk with them as an individual. If that doesn't work, you gather a few elders to go with you and try to work out the situation. Maybe somebody who's skilled in mediation or nonviolent communication. And then if that doesn't work, you go to your Sangha's ethics committee or grievance committee, or we call it the Sangha Harmony Committee, for help. And that committee, I think, should have somebody outside the Sangha on it. I don't think it works to have all people within the Sangha, because it's, what we discovered at UCLA is we were an alcoholic family. And we needed people from the outside to help us see that. So then if that doesn't work, the structure within the Sangha is then to go outside. Now the problem about going outside, like to the White Plum or the Soto Zen Buddhist Teachers Association or the American Zen Teachers Association, is those organizations in the past have said, we are not interested in this, it takes too much money and too much time, and we will not deal with issues like this. And yes, it takes time, and yes, it takes money, but we have to be a resource for people when it's not working at that. Go to the individual, get some elders to help, use your policy, your procedures in your own Sangha. People have to have another resource, because so often it's a incestuous family or an alcoholic family or an enabling family that you're working in.
And ultimately, if they have to go outside, they'll end up in the courts. That's the sort of ultimate option that people have when our structures are not able or willing to take care of their complaint, their experience. Scott?
Well, I want to applaud everything everyone said. I do want to add that we also have to understand that there's really two kinds of complaints. Number one is the complaint where the organization, the structure in which you're interacting, is reasonably healthy and set up to handle that complaint and willing to hear a complaint. If you've got a seriously dysfunctional organization, as is often the case in any religious tradition, and is certainly the case in a number of the Buddhist groups right now, I think it's helpful when people see that they're being kept out or pushed away or blamed. I would argue that's when you run the hell away and go ahead and use the power of the press. In this case, the internet. Of course, ideally it doesn't happen, but I think we need to do some kind of triage between those organizations where there is some hope for redress or an adequate hearing, and those where it's gotten cult-like, and no matter what you do, you're just going to get victimized again and again. So people need to understand that to make that sort of judgment for themselves, and if they discern, oh man, it's just going to get worse, it's time to get the hell out and keep themselves safe. And then maybe go public with something.
And in order to warn other people.
Indeed.
Yeah.
But I don't want to disparage anything that Jan or Wendy have said. I want to give them huge thumbs up. I think that everything they've said makes perfect sense for an organization that is, in general, functional.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think one precaution here, Scott, is that I have talked to people who are clearly mentally ill. And we have to protect the teachers too. There needs to be a policy and a way for grievances to be heard that's accessible, but can screen out things that, like teachers flying through the night in the air from coast to coast and in the middle of the night. I mean, I've talked to people who believe that happens. Yeah, and so we have to provide protection for both sides. Because any of us could be unjustly accused of anything, anytime.
And indeed, that happens. And so I think it is worth noting that it's easy to put teachers always in the role of first, and while in general, because of the power relationship, when there is something that's gone wrong, in general, it does tend to be the teacher, the clerk, as it were, and the student, the victim. I think I think, Jen, what you said is really important, that anybody can potentially harm or victimize anyone else. And we are indeed all in this together, and that's what's going on.
I think in order for us in our organization to deal with all of those realities, we have to have a pretty clear understanding of the dynamics of power and vulnerability and how they play out in our particular setting, so that when we're confronted with a particular situation, there's a discernment process as to what's going on here, an investigation process that then allows us to come to some conclusion that we can enact on. And so that's why policy and procedure and so forth are so critical. Unfortunately, our time has come to a close, and so I want to give each of you just a moment to conclude anything that you feel like you really want to make sure gets said before we finish up. I wish we had more time. Dan?
No, I'm just so glad that you did this, and that we've opened up on the national level or international level this discussion. As I said, secrecy and trying to keep things under wraps is so corrosive, and so to have a fresh air, open discussion is wonderful. Thank you. They trust Marie, Scott, and Wendy.
Thank you. Wendy?
Thank you. Yes, I learned a lot today. It's been refreshing, to just have a conversation about this, and maybe we have many more. We certainly need it on a sort of an international and a national level. We need help, and it's great to know that there are many people doing their best to address these issues. I guess the one thing I'm left with for sanghas and is what are the ongoing practices that a sangha can adopt on a regular basis, not just when there is a crisis,
Right.
But what are the practices and what containers do we need to keep practicing so that when we do have a crisis, we have a place to go.
Right.
We have a place to go. We don't have to all go, scattering throughout the universe. But we could actually, it could hold us together, and we could face the situation together in a wise and caring way.
And the image for me of that, Wendy, is what we do literally in the face of a tornado or a hurricane that comes through and devastates, physical building or whatever. What is it that a community has to draw on to then recover from that? And I think that's what you're advocating, and I look forward to your thoughts on that and ways in which we can begin to help people see that as a valuable resource that really serves their interest. Scott, any last words?
Well, again, I'm grateful to everyone as well. I think people have had wonderful things to say, really important things. I think if I wanted to add one final note, it would be to the individual congregation or Sangha members, in that in following any religious tradition, what we're trying to do is open up and grow up and become more human, become more ourselves, and that growing up part is important. Each of us needs to not put ourselves at the feet of an organization or a teacher as if we're the child and they're the parent. We need to show up as grown-ups, act like grown-ups, and the more we do that, the more we serve our fellow congregants or Sangha members, and the easier we make it for the teacher to do their job. So thank you all.
Very important point, Scott.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you all three of you for taking the time to be in this conversation, and all of you who have participated as well online, and thank you for your questions. I hope we touched on most of the concerns you were raising. And you will have an opportunity to get feedback, so please give us your feedback and let us know if you'd like to see this conversation continue. That's something that we could provide, because I feel like we simply didn't have enough time to get as far as we might. We might want to do another round of this a little bit later. So let us know what you think about that. And so I'm going to sign off and pass back to Emily for final conclusion here.
Great. Thank you. As Marie said, I think that's the only final note is that when you do close and X out your window today, a survey will pop up, so just take a moment to do that. And please visit our website, faithtrustitute.org, and there is where you can find the complete list of upcoming webinars as well as information on in-person and online trainings and our educational materials and consultation availability. So please visit that, and we hope that you will join us again for a webinar soon. Take care.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.